This is a story about discovery. Robert Arthur Moog was born in New York in 1934, and you might be seeing his name and thinking that it's pronounced Moog, and some people in his family did pronounce it that way, but Robert preferred the Moog pronunciation.
I just happen to like the sound of Moog better than Moog. Part of my family pronounces it one way, and part pronounces it the other way. In Holland, you would pronounce it Moog. Now that's a little bit too much. Yeah.
And Robert came from a family of scientists. His aunt Florence was a renowned biologist, and his dad was an engineer who worked for the Con Edison Company. And as a teenager, Robert would sneak down into his father's basement workshop and tinker with electronics himself. But what Robert was working on was musical instruments. Robert was obsessed with one of the original electronic instruments, the Theremin. The Theremin was invented in the 1920s by Leon Theremin, who was an engineer and an inventor who later dabbled in some light espionage against the United States. But he created this instrument that you used by waving your hands around a radio antenna, and it created this really spooky sound. And it was used in movie soundtracks, and in the 60s it was used in the Beach Boys song Good Vibrations. And Robert Moog started creating his own theremins when he was just 14 years old. He learned how to build one from an electronics magazine, and by the time he was 20, he actually started his own theremin making business. In 1954, he started R.A. Moog Company. His father built the cabinets and Robert built the circuitry for these theremins. But even though he started this business, this was mostly a hobby for Robert. He kept this business as a side hustle while he went to school. He went to Columbia and then went to grad school at Cornell, getting his PhD in engineering physics. But then in 1963, while he's still at Cornell, he meets this professor at Hofstra University who is also a jazz composer named Herb Deutsch. And Herb wanted Robert to make him an electronic instrument that he could use to make experimental jazz. Now, synthesizers did exist in the early 1960s, but they were mostly huge contraptions that could take up an entire room. Robert wanted to make something smaller and more practical for an actual musician to use. By 1964, he had created this instrument. It used voltage-controlled oscillators and voltage-controlled amplifiers, and key to the invention, no pun intended, was that it used a keyboard. Robert and Herb had actually debated what they should use to create the sounds for their instrument. They thought of using a trombone slide or a violin bow, but they decided that keyboards were readily available, so that's what they went with. Now, Robert and Herb have made this cool device that makes weird sounds that are perfect for what Herb wants to do and for other experimental composers of the time like John Cage. But to bring the Moog synthesizer to the masses, it's going to take somebody doing something more commercial. And in 1964, Robert meets that person at the Audio Engineering Society convention in New York City. That's where Bob meets this student and composer named Wendy Carlos. Wendy is more into classical music, and Wendy and Bob start working together as she helps him turn the Moog synthesizer into something more accessible for conventional musicians. People who wanted to actually play melodies.
And typically when Wendy and I got together, she would tell me what we did wrong. She would tell me what she would like to see us do. And we would go back and do it, and sometimes it took 3 or 4 times before we got it the way she liked it.
He was the engineer who spoke music, I was the musician who spoke engineering terms, and together we were able to come up with ideas that I don't think anyone would have come up with alone.
Now Bob and his Moog synthesizer start to make some inroads into popular music. In 1967, they bring the Moog synthesizer to the Monterey Pop Festival. And in that same year, the Doors are the first rock band to use a synthesizer on their album Strange Days. But then in 1968, the Moog really blows up. Because in 1968, Wendy Carlos releases an album herself. An album of Bach compositions that are played exclusively on a Moog synthesizer. The album is called Switched on Bach, and it becomes a huge success. It sells over 1 million copies, one of the best-selling classical albums of all time, and Wendy Carlos goes on to win 3 Grammy Awards for the album. She is also the first transgender woman to ever win a Grammy. And the success of Switched on Bach explodes the Moog synthesizer into the mainstream. A bunch of copycat albums come out that are actually dubbed Moogsploitation albums. And then you see artists like the Beatles using Moog synthesizers on Abbey Road, and Keith Emerson of the prog rock supergroup Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He's so inspired by Wendy Carlos that he starts incorporating the Moog synthesizer into Emerson, Lake and Palmer music. And the Moog synthesizer becomes ubiquitous in the 70s. Not just in prog rock, but also in funk. You can hear it on the Parliament song Flashlight. Stevie Wonder uses it. It's all over songs in the Key of Life. And the influence just cascades from there. into disco, new wave, synth pop,
hip-hop, industrial, house music, techno, electronica.
The Moog synthesizer becomes one of the most important musical instruments of all time. Now, funny enough, his invention didn't make Robert Moog super rich. He only ever patented one of his innovations. Most of the things that went into making the Moog synthesizer such a success were free for other companies to copy. And they did, which led to an explosion of other synthesizer companies and lots of competition. But Moog seemed okay with that. After the success of the Moog synthesizer, he lived a relatively quiet life. He moved with his family to North Carolina, where he taught at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He built his dream home in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he died in Asheville in 2005 at the age of 71. There's still a museum in Asheville dedicated to him to this day. And maybe he never got as wealthy as he could have if he had patented more of his inventions, but the world is a lot richer thanks to Robert Moog's work.
So we thought of the process of making the sounds as putting the parts together, which is what synthesize means, to put together something whole out of all of its parts. And that's when we decided to use the word synthesizer. We didn't mean to imply that what it made were synthetic sounds. They were synthesized sounds. They weren't fake anything. They were real synthesized sounds.